We're diving into the depths of Stage 4 fascism, which is the exercise of power.
Great, here we go again. Anything you people don't like is fascism.
No, fascism is not what I don't like, it's something very specific, and I don't use that term lightly.
The real fascists are the leftist Dems trying to limit my freedom of speech and my 2A rights.
Well, while that's a form of authoritarianism, that's not fascism. And Dems aren't leftists, they're corporate capitalists. The left was the sworn enemy of the fascists, and they were pretty upfront about their hatred for the democratic socialist and the Marxist.
Fine, what's your interpretation of fascism then?
Well, it's not my interpretation, but the leading expert on the subject stated that fascism may be defined as a form of political behavior, marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion. Maybe you've heard the parable of the two fish swimming in the ocean. One morning as they swim, they come across a third fish that says, "Top of the morning, isn't the water great today?" The two fish look at each other and they reply, "What the hell is water?" This story illustrates that if we don't know anything different, how can we recognize that which is familiar to us? It's similar to the metaphor of a frog in a pot of water that slowly heats up to a boil. When discussing something as horrific and traumatizing as fascism, we often think of imagery as colored shirts and goose-stepping soldiers, and the ultimate consequences of fascist actions. However, it is important to remember that fascism took over a decade to rise to power and commit those atrocities with the preconditions that allowed it to take root long before then. Fascism is not defined solely by its results. Rather, it is characterized by its ideology and the path that it follows in its ascent to power. It's not my intention to tell others what to think. All I can do is provide guidance on where to find your own answers. So, how did I come to the conclusion that we're currently experiencing Stage 4 fascism? I recommend 3 books to establish a fundamental understanding of this topic. The Anatomy of Fascism by Robert Paxton, Escape from Freedom by Erich Fromm, and How Fascism Works by Jason Stanley, in that order. There's certainly no shortage of academic work on this subject, and it is important to remain open to credible information. But these books can help create a solid foundation for analyzing current events. Fascism is a modern political ideology that has only been around for 100 years. To fully understand it, we need to explore the historical conditions that contribute to its emergence. Robert Paxton is a leading American expert on fascism, specializing in the social and political history of modern Europe, and holds a PhD from Harvard University. In 1998, Paxton published a paper titled The 5 Stages of Fascism, which outlines the process of fascism's rise to power. This paper is only 28 pages, and it's definitely worth reading. Additionally, his book, The Anatomy of Fascism, provides a detailed historical analysis on the subject. I recommend this book as an essential starting point in understanding fascism, covering its origins and characteristics. Written in 2004, it remains free of any bias towards current American political figures. In this detailed analysis, you will discover that fascism only arises in a failing liberal democracy that has lost the trust and confidence of its citizens. This situation often manifests as a dominant group within a social hierarchy that believes it has been deprived of its rightful status through nationalistic populism, rallies their supporters to reclaim the mythical past and restore themselves to a position they believe they deserve. This is always done through the political system of that nation, never taken by force in a coup. Fascists are welcomed in by the political elite who seem to be losing ground. Paxton writes, "We learn much more if we focus our gaze on the circumstances that favor fascist polarization within civil society and the deadlocks within the political system, and on the fascist accomplices and their allies." Where existing parties were run by parliamentarians who thought mainly of their own careers, fascist parties could appeal to idealists by being parties of engagement, in which committed militants rather than careerist politicians set the tone. He goes on to an analysis of other authoritarian regimes and failed attempts to make clear the distinction of fascism as a separate and a distinct ideology. In other words, all fascism is authoritarianism, but not all authoritarianism is fascist. Ultimately, the question remains, why would anyone subscribe to such a radical ideology despite all we have learned from the past? In Escape from Freedom, Erich Fromm provides a psychological perspective on the mindset that can lead to individuals adopting fascist beliefs. Fromm, a German social psychologist and a psychoanalyst who fled Germany during the rise of fascism, explores the internal drives rooted in social structures that compel people to submit to nationalist authoritarian ideologies. His analysis focuses on the emergence of modern Western ideologies tracing their roots back to the medieval era, and examines contradictions between individualism and economics within a society. A new despotism arose side by side with the new individualism. Freedom and tyranny, individuality and disorder were inextricably interwoven. The Renaissance was not a culture of small shopkeepers and petty bourgeois, but of wealthy nobles and burghers. Their economic activity and their wealth gave them a feeling of freedom and a sense of individuality. But at the same time, these same people had lost something, the security and feeling of belonging which the medieval social structure had offered. They were more free, but they were also more alone. They used their power and their wealth to squeeze the last ounce of pleasure out of life. But in doing so, they had used ruthlessly every means from physical torture to psychological manipulation to rule over the masses and to check their competitors within their own class. All human relationships were poisoned by their fierce life and death struggle for the maintenance of power and wealth. Solidarity with one's fellow man, or at least with members of one's own class, was replaced by a cynical, detached attitude. Other individuals were looked upon as objects to be used and manipulated, or they were ruthlessly destroyed if suited one's own ends. The individual was absorbed by a passionate egocentricity, an insatiable greed for power and wealth. As a result of all of this, the successful individual's relation to his own self, his sense of security and confidence were poisoned too. His own self became as much an object of manipulation to him as other people had become. In the rise of new economic forces and the liberalization of society, people had broken the communal ties that once held those people together. In their pursuit of personal freedom and individuality, they had become like the small fish in the big pond, which at times can overwhelm them. As a result, many seek an escape from that freedom. However, if the economic, social, and political conditions on which the whole process of human individuation depends do not offer a basis for the realization of individuality in the sense just mentioned, while at the same time people have lost those ties which gave them security, this lag makes freedom an unbearable burden. It then becomes identical with doubt, with a kind of life which lacks meaning and direction. Powerful tendencies arise to escape from this kind of freedom into submission of some kind of relationship to man and the world which promises relief from uncertainty, even if it deprives the individual of his freedom. The contradictions of individualism and the rise of nation-states create a tension between the freedom to move between social classes once determined at birth and the reliance on market forces that are beyond an individual's control. When these systems fail the individual, whether during economic collapse or the humiliation of war, they can lead to the emergence of compensatory cults of unity as described by Paxton. In such circumstances, it may seem that the path to freedom lies through subordination. For millions of people, the fascist government then became identical with Germany. Once he held power of the government, fighting him implied shutting one's self out of the community of Germans. When other political parties were abolished and the fascist party was Germany, opposition to it meant opposition to Germany. It seemed that nothing is more difficult for the average man to bear than that feeling of not being identified with a larger group. However, much of German citizens may be opposed to the principle of fascism. If he was to choose between being alone and feeling that he belongs to Germany, most persons will choose the latter. Ultimately, the pursuit of a collective can seem like salvation for the individual based on shared historical ties and identity. As a result, the manifestation of the fascist ideology is tied to specific geographic locations and the unique cultural characteristics of different populations. No two expressions of fascism are identical, even when driven by the same underlying forces. To return to Paxton, no swastikas in an American fascism, but stars and stripes, or stars and bars and Christian crosses. No fascist salute, but mass recitations of the Pledge of Allegiance. These symbols contain no whiff of fascism in themselves, of course, but an American fascism would transform them into obligatory litmus tests for detecting the internal enemy. This leads us to the contemporary analysis of modern fascism. In his book, How Fascism Works, Jason Stanley, a former professor at Yale University, explores the rise of fascist ideologies in American society today. Personally, I feel at times in this book the distinction between authoritarianism and fascism becomes blurred. However, with the insights provided by the previous two books, readers should have a solid foundation to form their own conclusions. Published in 2018, Stanley's work can be examined alongside Robert Paxton's 5 Stages of Fascism. Based on Paxton's framework, it seems we have recently entered Stage 4. As I am only providing sources where one can find answers, and I have no intention of persuading anyone about the current state of affairs, I encourage you to read this book and arrive at your own understanding. If after learning about the characteristics of fascism, you have concluded that we are currently witnessing its rise, the obvious question is, what should we do about it? Fascism can be prevented from taking hold in a political institution during its early stages, when liberalism still has the confidence of its population. It depends on a losing class of elites who concede their values and partner with fascists to gain power. Without this collaboration, fascism remains a fringe ideology that rarely is taken seriously. Unfortunately, we have passed that point. Historically, once fascism establishes itself as a political party within a governing system, the only way it has to be subdued is through complete and total annihilation. The belief that simply replacing a leader will resolve the problem ignores the underlying issues that enable its rise in the first place. Fascism will always be a possibility within a liberal republic. One of the only ultimate solutions to prevent any form of fascism from taking root would be to eliminate all institutions of control and domination over others. This would require a decentralized society of rotating public servants elected by citizens, with limited authority confined to their designated tasks, and subjected at any time to recall. Such a system would entirely remove anyone's ability to gain substantial power over others. Historically, these decentralized systems were rather common, and while there are small movements implementing these horizontal systems, such as Rojava or the EZLN, attempting to practice this on a large scale might seem futile in the light of the dominance of imperialistic empires and global economic systems. However, the history of human civilization has been marked by a succession of systems. In the words of Ursula Le Guin, we live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. But that will never happen until we first realize that we are swimming in water.